started, so I'm going to go ahead and hand it to our speakers to begin.
Welcome, everybody. We'd like to welcome you to our session, Systemic Approaches to Food Policy and Food Security in the Post-COVID Era. We are thrilled to be here with you all today. My name is Ann Palmer, and I work at the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future at the Bloomberg School of Public Health. I'm joined by Michael J. Wilson and Heather Bruskin, who I have had the pleasure of collaborating with for several years on food system activities in Maryland. Next slide, Heather.
Hang on, sorry.
Okay. So I'll just start with the session overview. I'm going to be discussing the role of multi-sectoral alliances in strengthening food policy. I'm also going to share some examples from around the country of what that looks like at the state level. Heather's going to be talking about the work of the Food Systems Resiliency Council for Food System Resiliency Office for Montgomery County in her role as director. Michael J. is the executive director of Maryland Hunger Solutions, and he's going to be sharing about our work on the Maryland Food System Resiliency Council and the Regional Council of Governments and how we work for systems change. So I am part of a team that works on a project called Food Policy Networks. We've been around since 2013, and the goal is to build the capacity of food policy councils in similar groups that have diverse multi-sector people involved. This is a list of the activities that we implement, and I'm going to be presenting some data today, and that is from our 2020 survey of food policy councils. We started gathering that about 5 or 6 months after the pandemic started. Next. One of the survey questions we asked them is about membership. And this graph shows what sectors are represented with membership and gives you an idea of who participates in food policy councils. You'll notice that community members represent the largest sector, and that's followed by anti-hunger and emergency food providers, food production, public health, government staff, etc. Next. We also wanted to understand what policies did councils engage with during the pandemic. So we asked, which areas has your food policy council helped to develop or advocated for policies in response to COVID-19? And this could either be their direct work or by supporting efforts led by another organization. And this is a really interesting slide, I think, especially for this audience, is that not surprising, emergency food provision was the first area, followed by direct markets for local producers. We know a lot of producers lost their supply chains during the pandemic and needed new places to be able to send their product. The next following was federal food and nutrition. And this would be SNAP and WIC programs, food production, and then federal child nutrition programs, which included summer meals and school meals. And then it just kind of goes down the line, urban ag, et cetera. So you get the sense for there's a wide variety of work happening under the pandemic, and it is in a pretty wide range of policy areas. Heather, you can do the next one. Another question we asked regarding policy was what were their top 3 priorities in light of the pandemic? And so this breakdown isn't dissimilar from maybe other years. So healthy food access is always big, anti-hunger and anti-poverty work, food production, economic development. But what you will notice is the brown arrows indicate areas with that there was a noticeable increase in the Food Policy Council's engagement in those policy issues. So definitely, while they had been doing anti-hunger work, this really took one of the front stages, as did transportation and distribution. We know there were a lot of supply chain issues that needed to be dealt with. The other area to notice would be food labor. Not very many food policy councils had worked on labor issues, and we saw a pretty large increase around food labor. Next, Heather. Now I'm going to talk about a couple of examples that we have. One of them is the West Virginia Food and Farm Coalition. They are a statewide nonprofit that works on a variety of food policy issues, both for producers and for consumers. They started in 2010, and they engaged state government, food security organizations, and producers. During the pandemic, they have a program called Farm Fresh West Virginia, and that connects organizations and people to a variety of food and ag businesses. During the pandemic, that role increased because there was such a dramatic need for agricultural businesses to find new places to be sending product. They also work with the House of Delegates to create a working group on food security, and they advocated to the Department of Agriculture for state dollars to support what they call their SNAP stretch, which is the state's double bucks program for fruits and vegetables. Next. Rhode Island Food Policy Council is another nonprofit. It was founded in 2011. They work on policy advocacy, partnership development, and program implementation. During the pandemic, they strengthened and expanded their already pretty strong state network and included a number of private and public partners that had not participated before. They launched emergency food access efforts with the state and these partners to ensure that food insecure people were being fed. One of the projects they did that was pretty interesting is they piloted a home delivery program for homebound SNAP participants to use their EBT cards for grocery shopping. And they're hoping to expand this throughout the state, looking at this as a model. In addition, they supported farm, fish, and food businesses to find new markets to replace the markets lost during the pandemic. Next. The Arizona Food System Network is supported. It's a project of another nonprofit, and that nonprofit, Pinnacle, actually does a variety of food system work throughout the state. Their funding comes from a health foundation. They also work on policy planning and programs. And during the pandemic, they had a partnership with the governor's office to get direct the COVID relief funding for the SNAP fruit and vegetable incentives, and also for emergency food providers. They did some more with the Double Bucks program and the Farmers Market Nutrition program. Those are ongoing, but were enhanced during the pandemic. They do advocacy and education on the state policy process, so people know where they can weigh in and advocate for particular policies. And they recently launched a multi-year statewide food action plan that looks at access, agriculture, and climate change. Next. So my last slide is going to be a summary of kind of what we've learned over the past 3 years on what do we need to do to build a more resilient food systems. Food policy councils, their role is really to build relationships. And I think those existing relationships really help them mobilize quickly during the pandemic in a way that nobody ever anticipated they would have to. One of the interesting relationships and partnerships that developed is about 25% of councils reported having a new relationship with the emergency management office. And they were there representing the food system and the food sector. A lot of those offices did not have food represented prior to this time. There were a number of about 25% that already had an existing relationship, but the fact that 25% developed a new one was pretty significant. I think the other thing is that the pandemic offered a window to really advance many food system policies that had been kind of languishing or that people had not really paid attention to. There's been a dramatic increase in attention to racial disparities. And I think, we've seen this with the councils that we've worked with across the country, and how that has really, a lot of groups have been playing kind of front and center, trying to figure out how they integrate racial equity into their internal policies and their external work. We saw increased flexibility for federal program implementation that we hadn't seen before, and that was certainly by demand. And then increased attention to policies that affect food system workers, and that gets back into the labor issues. And then I think the other thing we learned is that, governments started to recognize that they needed to pay attention to food systems, especially food security. And that isn't something you can just kind of leave to the wayside and expect that some other sector is going to take that on. So I will stop there and turn it over to Heather.
Great. Thanks so much, Anne. I am honored to be with all of you today. Thank you for the opportunity to get to share a little bit about the work that we're doing in Montgomery County, Maryland, so just outside of Washington, D.C. I'm Heather Breskin. I'm the director of the county's Office of Food Systems Resilience, and we'll have the opportunity this morning, or this afternoon, I guess depends on where you are, to share a little bit about what we're doing here to look at food through a systems-based lens and build resilience in our community for future crises. So our mission is focusing on pulling those unique levers to local government to build resilience in our community, and thinking about resilience not just for individuals or for government, but our community as a whole. And whether it's a pandemic, climate change, or a wide variety of other potential disruptions, there are a lot of challenges to our food system. And we've really seen how both from the local to the national level, these systems are very fragile and need to be strengthened for the future. So a little bit about how we got started. Our office was created in June of 2022, so just last year, by action of the County Council at the request of our county executive, and building on the recommendations of our Food Security Task Force, which shepherded our food security strategies and response during the pandemic. And one of the greatest findings of that work was how there was very limited capacity within county government. We have a very strong network of community food assistance providers and other nonprofit and for-profit entities. But within government itself, there are tools that only can be accessed particularly during emergencies. And we need to strengthen that infrastructure for building future resilience and looking at food through its own unique lens in all the work of government, because food is often so embedded within agencies across government that we're not looking at it as an individual strategy and issue area. Our legislative mandates, it's robust and extensive. I'll share that in addition to myself, we have just two other incredible colleagues, one who focuses on policy management and programs and collaborations, the other focused exclusively on data. And so we've aligned our strategic priorities as well as our staffing strategies to try to cover these mandates as comprehensively as possible. Our four core values that guide the work of our office, everything from priority setting to strategies for pursuing those priorities. And so again, we cover when we're evaluating possible areas of focus, we apply all of these lenses and make sure that our work is actually moving the needle on equity and intentionally addressing social injustice and the racial disparities that exist in all areas of our community. Our strategies, systems-based, are aspects of food at the same time. Are they innovative? Are we leveraging those best practices and models from other jurisdictions? And are we looking at these issues and approaching them in new ways? And then finally, are our financial decisions as well as our policy decisions really informed by and driven by the data that we have, and intentionally seeking to better understand both the extent of the issues that we're seeking to address and the impact of the strategies that we implement. I'll share here briefly the four kind of main focus areas that we see local government having in addressing food system issues. The first is policy, so that can be big P or little p policy, but looking at all of our legislative strategies, the way we apply zoning, planning partnerships, and also the little p of the programmatic efforts, because creating policies officially is the first step, but really its impact and success comes in how they're implemented effectively or not. Looking also at investment. So part of that is the grants that we invest with community partners, the contracts that we have with vendors, and our procurement strategies, but also how do we leverage our own resources? What does our food sourcing look like for our own operations, or even for on a small scale in day-to-day office management and event planning? The third piece is how are we showing up in collaboration and partnership, both with other agencies within government and in partnership with the many different community experts and resident voices that are critical in shaping this work. And then finally, are we both collecting, analyzing, and most importantly, sharing the information that we're collecting about the state of our food system? So we have a theory of change here that I share, just I think as a way to illustrate how we see food security initiatives intersecting with other aspects of the food system, and how if we want to make as multi-valued investments as possible, we need to try to touch multiple areas of the food system at once and how they're all kind of intrinsically interconnected. So the way that we're approaching climate change intersects with economic opportunity, emergency preparedness, and food access and security. And at the nexus of all of those pieces is racial equity and social justice. Now, I want to be explicit in saying that doesn't mean that if we're addressing all of these areas and applying systems-based approaches, that we're automatically achieving and pursuing our equity and social justice priorities as well. So that is still something that needs to intentionally be laid as a lens over everything that we do. The kind of post-pandemic era, really looking at what are our key priorities for the strategies that we're pursuing. First, we recognize that as federal dollars are receding and in most places really gone in terms of funding the food security work that we did during the pandemic, we need to make sure that all of the investments that we're making are pursuing multiple priorities at once. So as we approach food insecurity, are we also supporting our farms and local businesses? Are we investing in the local economy and workforce development opportunities? Are there value-added education and climate change impacts of these efforts? We're intentionally setting our performance goals in advance and centering data collection and analysis in all phases, and not just in creating programs, but in regularly evaluating them to make sure that they are as high impact as possible and having the desired outcomes. We need to maximize federal dollars as much as possible, as well as resources from the state. So, and first, by maximizing enrollment in federal programs like SNAP. We need to make sure that we're aligning our capacity in the community with the goals and expectations that we have of vendors and the nonprofit sector, so that we're giving them the resources that they need to have effective staff and operations, and the flexibility that they need to be prepared for the future crises, because we do rely on our nonprofit partners so extensively. Then we need to recognize that we're operating in a capitalist system. And so we need to leverage market drivers wherever possible to be cost efficient and effective, and make sure that our investments are aligned with our values in terms of our food purchasing and other partnerships. And then finally, more effectively leaning on grants as tools for investing in community efforts to be more transparent and inclusive with a wide range of organizations, and not just those that have the kind of experience and longevity that makes them more prepared to access public dollars and grant programs. Quickly of the types of initiatives that our office is working on. We're, again, shaping that post-COVID food security strategy. We're doing a variety of data and policy landscape assessments to understand what commitments and investments our county has already made around these priorities, developing a local level food security index to better understand what the shifts and trends are in food security in our community, establishing intentional feedback loops, not just with organizational partners and businesses, but also with residents themselves, to make sure we're engaging their voices and expertise, and mapping our infrastructure and making strategic plans for expansion. Beyond what we're doing right now, planning in the next few months and in the coming year to more intentionally coordinate agencies, both at the leadership level as well as those embedded within agencies and doing food work, often kind of independently siloed on a daily basis. We're looking at all of our procurement strategies and finding ways that we can implement procurement policies across county government, as well as organics recycling and other policies, so that we are walking the talk ourselves as a government of the priorities that we have set for our community as a whole. And then finally, making sure we have built on the lessons learned of the pandemic and have intentional emergency preparedness plans in place for whatever comes next. And so all of these priorities are directly reflected in the ways that we're planning for the next fiscal year's budget related to food security. And that it's not, let's fund this in 3 to 6 month chunks and see where the food security demand for services goes, but rather recognize that this is an ongoing and sustained challenge in our community, and we need to have long-term intentional plans in place. One example of that is our strategy to end childhood hunger, which was launched under the leadership of our then County Council President, Gabe Albornoz, in partnership with the executive and our county's food council, created this strategy to address childhood hunger in our community, where we have tens of thousands of children who have insufficient access to nutritious food. And so these are just some examples of those value-added strategies where we are not simply purchasing food and distributing it in the community, but doing so in locations that are already convenient and accessed by our families, like schools and healthcare sites. We're striving to leverage partnerships with both federal programs as well as private sector partners wherever possible, making investments in infrastructure, as well as investing in more of the food sovereignty priorities, like expanding opportunities for our residents to grow their own food themselves at home or in their communities. Just giving a quick example here of our evaluation framework, how we're looking at not just outputs, which often you'll see in food security work, but how is it moving the needle on our health outcomes priorities, or even things like local food production. Also the data that we will be collecting and regularly analyzing, and hopefully capturing and communicating in a dashboard that's publicly available to show our progress and where we have room for growth. And then just some final examples of all the different ways that we're engaging, not just within the partnerships in the county level, but within the state. Michael J. will talk a little bit about our state food council, as well as with entities like our local council of governments in the metropolitan Washington region. Slides after, so all of you can see our slides and get this contact information again. But for now, I'll turn it over to Michael J.
Thank you, Heather. And thank you to all the folks who are watching and participating. We're looking forward to your questions, and we'll respond to those as soon as we finish this part of the presentation. And I want to start by introducing myself, Michael J. Wilson. I'm the director of Maryland Hunger Solutions, and we are a proud project of the Food Research and Action Center. Next slide, please. Maryland Hunger Solutions is a statewide, nonpartisan nonprofit, and we work across the entire state to try to address food insecurity and to promote well-being and nutrition for everyone in the state of Maryland. Next slide. And so we do this work usually using 4 basic tools. We use the tool of advocacy, we use the tool of outreach, we use the tool of research, and we use collaboration. And I'm going to spend obviously a lot of time today talking about collaboration. So with advocacy, we are advocates at the local, the state, and the federal level. And as an example, I would say, in 2016, when we knew that the minimum SNAP benefit was $16 a month, and we would say that to legislators, and they would say, you said 6, you didn't say 16, did you? And, people don't recognize the challenges that folks who are actually using these programs actually have. And we said, no, it's actually 16. And we were able to boost the supplemental benefit by using state dollars. It wasn't as much as we wanted or as much as we thought it should be. And it got to be $30, but only for those who are 62 and over. And so that's the kind of advocacy where we get half a loaf, to use the food pun, we get half a loaf, but we continue to work to try to build on that. And so advocacy is a clear part of the strategies that we use. We also use outreach. One of the tools we have at Maryland Hunger Solutions is we have a toll-free number that anyone in the state of Maryland can call us and get SNAP application assistance. As I often say, doing a SNAP application on your own is a little bit like doing your own taxes. For some people, that's really easy. For some people, that's really hard. And most would rather have the assistance of folks like Maryland Hunger Solutions to help them work through those applications. And we are an authorized partner of the State Department of Human Services, as I know many others are around the country, to help people be able to do SNAP applications so that they can get the benefits to which they are entitled. The other thing we do is research. And so we know that focused research about the issues that we're working on, about the impact on folks in our state, is really critical, both for outreach, but also for advocacy. And so one of the things that we have done over time is we built our hunger profiles, where we put into a single database the SNAP participation per county, the WIC participation per jurisdiction, by county or jurisdiction, the school meal participation, and poverty rates. And by putting that all in one place and having it for every jurisdiction, we have 25 counties in Maryland, plus Baltimore City, which is not in a county. We're able to provide actual data to policymakers, to the press, to the public, so they can actually see what's really going on in the world, in Maryland, around food insecurity. And then the fourth part is collaboration, and this is clearly important to us in terms of the work that we do with food systems. We know that we don't touch food, and that if people need food right away, we need to connect them to a food bank or to a food pantry in our community. And we can do that throughout the state. We know that there are other folks who are working on housing or on utility assistance, and those are critical for folks who are experiencing poverty. But it's not just about food, but it's also how we can build those collaborations. And so those kinds of collaborations, either from partner organizations or through broader coalitions, are critical for us to be able to be successful in the work that we are doing. And so one of the ways we do this work is thinking systemically about food systems and how are we working with these systems. So next slide, please. These systems are, well, I went backwards. There you go. So food systems are very complicated, as we all know. Think of food systems, you think about farms, you think about retailers, we think about food processors or food distributors. We have wholesalers, and we have at the end of the line those who are disposing of, residual food products, and all of that is part of food systems. But food systems are more complicated. If I could have the next slide, Heather. Food systems also include people. So we don't have food systems without people. And by people, I mean every one of us who do the work that we do, but everyone who's a food consumer is part of the food system. We don't have food systems without consumers. We don't have food systems in this country without retail clerks or meat cutters. We don't have food systems in this country without farmers and with farm workers. We don't have food systems without cooks and chefs and waiters and waitresses and all the other parts. And so while systems have parts that are clearly organizations or companies or government agencies, at the end of the day, we have to recognize that people are a big part of the food system as well. Next slide. So in Maryland, we have a wide variety and a wide diversity of folks who we work with. In addition to the 25 counties in Baltimore City, we have food policy councils in Montgomery County, where Heather is, in Prince George's County, in Baltimore City, in Anne Arundel County, in Caroline County, and in the Upper Shore, and lots of places. So we have local jurisdictions that have food policy councils. In addition, we have food banks. We have a food bank, we have the Maryland Food Bank, we have the Capital Area Food Bank, and between the two of them, they cover most of our state, but we also have the Manna Food Center and the Southern Maryland Food Bank and an Anne Arundel County Food Bank and a Howard County Food Bank. So we have food banks as well that are all part of the system in Maryland. Here's the, and there are others as well, but here's the other part that's critically important for our understanding. It's not just about the state of Maryland, because Maryland touches other states from Delaware to Pennsylvania to Virginia and West Virginia and the District of Columbia. We touch all of those other places. And so if you're on the eastern shore of Maryland and you're thinking about local food systems, you are actually closer to Delaware, the state of Delaware, than you are to Western Maryland. If you're in Western Maryland, you are closer to West Virginia and Pennsylvania than you are to the state capital in Annapolis. And so thinking about food systems and thinking what's local, let's be really clear that what's local may not just fall within the boundaries of a state or the boundaries of a county or the city. Let's think really broadly, systemically, because people move and go all across. You know, I was really impressed with the Prince George's Food Equity Council because they used to talk about the work that they did affecting people who lived, worked, worshiped or visited the county. And so it's not just about residents, it's about other folks who are coming through transient for whatever reasons, for a long time or a short time, but really thinking systemically, not just about just the potential voters in that jurisdiction. Next slide. So I'm going to touch a little bit about the Maryland Food System Resilience Council, and I appreciate what Ann had said earlier, giving us examples of other states. So in Maryland, we, for years, have been working to try to put together a statewide food council, but it wasn't until the pandemic happened that the legislature recognized that, you know, it sure would have been a good thing if before the pandemic that we'd recognize that the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Human Services, the Department of Health, the Education Department all have parts of this food system, and we need to be better coordinated. And that included the emergency food system and the folks who are doing SNAP outreach and the outreach organizations, that we really needed a collaboration at the state level. So in 2021, we actually created our Maryland Food System Resilience Council, and there are 24 members from around the state who are part of this, not just the state agencies, but from nonprofits and others from across the state who work collaboratively, both on policy and on outreach and on best practices, so we can build a more resilient food system, which doesn't happen unintentionally. We have to be intentional about doing that. So we have a annual report which is due to the legislature every year. During our legislative session, which lasts for 10 weeks, we have a public meeting led by members of our council, looking at all of the legislation that might impact food or food systems. And that could be things from residual food disposal to water quality to school meal programs. It covers the whole spectrum, the whole menu of those things. And we have that in a public way, so members of the public can see those conversations and can understand how we are trying to think systemically in the state of Maryland. There have been things we have not done well in Maryland. I will admit that. When we created the restaurant meals program in SNAP, at the end of the pandemic, we had a couple of restaurants participating. You know, this is a program where some SNAP beneficiaries can actually use their benefits at a participating restaurant. But we didn't take advantage of that throughout the pandemic. And I'm not sure why, but we needed to have done a better job to collaborate and to promote these kinds of programs. We've done better in other places. So like many of you, we have a matching dollars program in Maryland. It's called Maryland Matching Money. Maryland Money, yeah. And so we have that for our farmers markets, for low-income participants to be able to get matching dollars. But we also recognize that in some cases, those matching dollars were too low. We're going to match every dollar you spend up to $5. In this economy is not enough. Everything up to $10 is still not enough. If we really want to have low-income participants join us at the farmers markets and participate, we need to make it more robust. And we've had conversations, and we've made adjustments to make it more robust across the state. And that didn't happen just accidentally. And it wasn't because people didn't know or didn't realize, but having active conversations among those of us at the Food Council helped us to be able to raise those amounts to have a bigger impact. And we're looking to have even bigger impacts moving forward. Next slide, please. So the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments has been around for a long time. They actually began in 1957. They worked obviously on issues around transportation, because whether you're in Virginia or DC or Maryland, even those of you who visited have seen the Beltway, or you've flown into Washington National Airport or Dulles Airport or Baltimore, Washington. We needed to have coordination throughout the entire Metropolitan Washington Council. And they did a lot of issues on transportation, and then on the environment, and on housing, and on public safety. But eventually they began to recognize that they needed to think about food as well. And so the food system part, creating the farm committee was critical. I remember one of our early meetings, they were talking across jurisdictions about the farms in their different jurisdictions and how they had to connect about farms. And I think that's important, but I also raised my hand and said there are other things all these jurisdictions have in common. Every single jurisdiction has a school system. Every school system has a school meals program. And we need to think about ways we can share best practices and be more supportive and be more engaged in those programs as well, because we want to make sure that we're actually feeding kids as best we can, whether they're in DC, or they're in Arlington, or whether they're in Montgomery County. We really need to focus on that. And we built up the farm committee, and we are having really good conversations about how we can connect throughout the area. Here's what I will say. You can be a SNAP participant living in Virginia. You can take the Metro at no cost and go through DC and spend your SNAP dollars at a farmer's market in Montgomery County and get benefits, get double bucks. And that's good for the participants, that's good for our system, and thinking systemically helps us get there. And so there are two more things I would say. I have a last slide, I think, Heather. Everyone should think about how they can participate in food systems in their community. And I know that we all do things locally. I would tell you, because Ann's not going to tell you how she grows. She makes honey. And so that's a local activity, but she also works across the country with food systems. And Heather is a big participant in her school system. But it's also building systemically. And we've all got to think systemically beyond our day jobs or our day activity, because the only way we're going to actually make change and build resilience is to think systemically. And I would encourage everybody to join us in thinking systemically and working systemically and collaboratively. And so I would first say I'm so glad to do this with Ann and with Heather, who I've worked collaboratively with for several years in various different entities, from Howard County to Montgomery County to the state system. And we're building it. We're not there yet, but we're glad to share our best practices with you. And I know that we had a question in the chat. I'm going to turn to that question because it was a question for Heather, which is, do you have specific examples for your investment priority? You talked about investments in Montgomery County and the work that you're doing.
Yes, I appreciate that very much. And I'm new to this platform, so I appreciate everybody's patience as I figure out the technology. So, yes, so thank you for that question. I think it is a combination of investments through grants. Obviously, that's a key strategy for supporting. In our county, we have over 100 nonprofit organizations, about half of which are faith-based communities that do food assistance work. And that varies tremendously in terms of format, population served. And so grants is a key component of that, and also ideally renewable grants that can allow for multi-year partnerships. At the same time, continuing ongoing contract partnerships with a lot of these community-based organizations as well as vendors. And so looking at ways that we can streamline data collection, both in terms of what data is collected and how it's collected from each of these grant or contract partners, so that we can have a more holistic view of what the landscape looks like related to food security services, and identify and close gaps as needed each year. And so I think those are some of the more traditional examples of investments. But I think also when we consider how we invest our dollars in food sourcing, and that's everything from coffee that we use in county office buildings to the types of food that is served in food service facilities, whether it's at office cafeterias or in our correctional facility. And I think there's a lot of really important ways that we can invest those dollars in ways that align with our values, from labor to climate to a wide variety of other priorities. And similarly, how we leverage our infrastructure, whether that's public land for food production and community gardens and farming, or whether it's space that could be repurposed for cold storage or other purposes that are really lacking right now. So those are just some examples of what we're looking at.
Thank you, Heather. So I don't see other questions in the chat, but I have a question. I loved Ann's examples about all the different food policy councils at the state level, from West Virginia to Rhode Island to Arizona. I know we talked about Colorado before, and Maryland clearly has it. We're about to do a farm bill in the next year. Should we consider having a national food policy council, a council that kind of look broadly at our food systems and not just depend on the Department of Agriculture to think about agriculture programs and not recognize the connection to health, which the Department of Health and Human Services might have, and to think about how we really think systemically about these issues? Either of you have a thought about that?
That's a great question, Michael J. And, you know, I remember a few years ago, there were I want to say Ricardo Salvador from the Union of Concerned Scientists and 3 other folks. I don't remember who it was. Heather, I don't know if you do, who wrote about that, actually, that exact idea of creating a national food policy council that would be addressing those issues, because I think there is recognition that the way it's set up right now does not lend itself easily to collaboration. And in fact, you know, makes it incredibly difficult sometimes. And I know that I think it was in an editorial that they brought that was posited, and I don't remember where that landed, but I think it is, you know, it's we always are thinking about how do we connect the work that's happening in all these different locations. We track groups that we call collaborators, or conveners is the term we use, and because there are several states in the U.S. who have so many food policy councils that they have an organization or an entity that is bringing them together, and oftentimes they are building their capacity to do policy work at the local level, and in some cases they're actually advocating at the state level, and you know, on up to the federal level. So it varies in terms of their function, but I think there's a lot of efforts happening, and those are across the state. I mean, we've got, you know, Michigan, North Carolina, California, Oregon. I mean, there's just all kinds of Maine. I'm going to miss there's a whole bunch of them out there, Ohio, but you know, a lot of the states where there's some pretty incredible work happening to build, you know, greater civic engagement in people's in the food system, people's interest in it.
Heather, you want to add anything?
No, I think Anne did a terrific job there, but I think it's always valuable to be aware and communicate how much federal policy impacts local policy, and work with our local elected officials to communicate that as well through their unique legislative relationships, and how the states usually play a critical role in facilitating both directional communication and resource flow. So I think, although my work is deeply rooted in the local, I stay keenly aware of the federal shifts, because what that means typically is if resources are shifting, it puts more of a burden on us. And so to close those gaps, and we constantly find ourselves in the post-COVID space doing more with less. And so how can we remind our partners at state and federal levels how much that impacts constituents locally?
So we've got less than a minute left, and I just wanted to reference one other thing. When there was a White House conference a couple of years ago about hunger and health, and it struck me as so short-sighted to have a one-time event when we really need a continuing effort that's broad-based. And I'm not sure that a food council is the answer, but I think it's worth having the conversation. I also know that Danny's put another question in about looking at food systems with the East Coast versus the West Coast. And I don't want to not answer the question, but I know I've got 20 seconds left. And so I really want to give both of you a chance to kind of wrap up, and I will be quiet while you do that. Anne?
I have not really compared them in any sort of systematic way, so I feel like I'd just be shooting from the hips. That I would say from that we tend to look to California for a lot of more progressive policies, because they do oftentimes are in that space where they are creating policy that other states have not undertaken, and they have the political culture to do that. And they also are growing a significant amount of our food. So they have a vested interest from for producers and for the workers to really, create a different, create a model that, could be followed. So I'll stop there. There's some wonderful work going out there, and the East Coast as well. It's just, it looks different depending on where you're sitting from.
And with that, I'm going to thank Anne, and I'm going to thank Heather, and I'm going to thank folks for giving us an opportunity to have this conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Stay well.
Thank you so much to all of our speakers. Up next, we have a 30-minute break, so be sure to take that time to check out our sponsors' exhibitor booths or some on-demand content. And then we'll see you back here at 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific for your choice of one of 4 sessions. Thank you so much. That concludes our time together. Enjoy the rest of the conference.